the foods that we grow, the relationship that we must have with the land is the most important relationship when it comes to healthcare, because it all starts there. That's the very beginning.
Welcome to the Doctor's Pharmacy. I'm Dr. Mark Hyman. That's Pharmacy with an F, F-A-R-M-A-C-Y, a place for conversations that matter. And if you care about the state of our healthcare in America and the state of our agricultural system and how to fix it, this conversation is going to matter because it's with Paulette Jordan, an extraordinary woman. She's a member of the Coeur tribe. She was the 2018 Democratic gubernatorial nominee in Idaho, was the first woman nominated to the position by a major party in the state, and the first Native American woman to be nominated for governor in the United States history, which is really unfortunate and way too long in coming. More Idahoans cast their vote for Paulette in 2018 than they had for any other Democratic gubernatorial or congressional candidate in Idaho history. She clearly hit a nerve there. She's a candidate for the U.S. Senate, and she has been recognized in Idaho and across the nation as an incredible leader and also pretty audacious in her views. And today we're going to talk about things she really cares about, which is how her upbringing on a reservation in Idaho in a Native American tribe affected her view of health and healthcare and agriculture and how they're connected. So Paulette, maybe you could take us through how you began to start thinking about these issues and what in your upbringing really on your family farm in Coeur d'Alene on the reservation led you to think about land and preservation and to fight for the needs of your community and to fight for healthcare, and how this growing up in that environment helped you shape your views and this connection to Idaho and the people who live there, and really has broad implications for the rest of our world too.
It has. And first of all, thanks for having me, Mark. And it's a very kind introduction. Thank you. I will tell you, growing up on the reservation in a rural countryside of North Idaho, it was a blessing in disguise, although it was very remote. And I will tell you that there were some challenges. And I learned a lot of lessons from my elders because I was raised by my elders. But everything was connected from land to healthcare, our way of life, our being fiscally accountable, all of these things. And it goes hand in hand. So when you're talking about healthcare, to me, you're talking about food sovereignty, you're talking about prosperity, and of course, even cultural sustainability. So for me, it is everything. And it's like we often say water is life because of the local Standing Rock battle that we've had. We often will have ceremonies around water in our sustainable use of our natural resources. So it is our way of life as Indigenous peoples, and healthcare is on the top of that list because it's connected to our environment.
Yeah, and I think you said something that was very interesting, which is a different way of framing how we learn from the past. In America, we call old people aged, which is kind of a pejorative, derogatory term. You talk about elders, which implies wisdom and connection to the past and understanding of the future. And how do the lessons that they taught you about the land, about taking care of the earth, about health and taking care of yourself affect what you're doing now?
Well, when you're raised on a traditional landscape, meaning, elders surrounding you, and every day you wake up, they're talking about the relationship that you have with the land and your elders and your ancestors had with the land. That's all you know. And honestly, it becomes your everyday way of thinking. So it's just commonplace. It may not be for everybody, but that's just the way I was raised, and many of the folks in my community were raised. And I think that's also, why we as Indigenous peoples hold such a high responsibility to enact, what we are taught and ensure that we're carrying this message forward. And that's really a big part of why we respect our elders so much. They have this vast wisdom and knowledge and sense of being. And because they're so beholden to their purpose here in this life spiritually, they pass that down on to us younger ones. And so we then learn to find our purpose sooner than later and then adhere to that purpose. And now, we have to teach our children the same thing. So they also remind us to, pay it forward. And that's, to me, it's a very selfless way of being, but that's what leadership is about. Leaders create other leaders, and create other leaders in terms of being natural resource ambassadors, ambassadors of humanity, ambassadors of peace.
Amazing. And you're one of the few people in politics who I've even heard use the word functional medicine. And I heard you on a podcast with a friend of mine, James Maskell. I was like, wow, how does she know about functional medicine and integrative medicine? And how does that actually connect to the way she was brought up? And why are you so focused on this? And why do you think it's such an important part of healthcare?
Well, I've always been about people first policy, and all of my legislation, having served in public office. And I would say that typically, when I speak of healthcare, I'm talking about having a conversation about, real coverage and being holistic and integrative. My community that I come from, we want our people to live a long life. And my grandmother, who was a medicine woman, she also believed in holistic medicine. So it's not new to us as Indigenous peoples. We've always had practices that are about longevity. But now we're working with a political system, and I'm working within a political structure that is broken, and it's challenging for all Americans who are looking for healthcare that truly works. And I'm not beholden to corporations, so you're looking at someone who, wants to fix the healthcare system for one that isn't working, but that costs too much for most people who in this country cannot afford it. But I'm also about incorporating nutritional strategies, like many who are talking about food sovereignty. And now, as we're dealing with COVID, now we're talking about how important it is for us to understand that what we put into our bodies is really medicine. We have to ensure that what we put in is pure and is clear of contaminants or chemicals that are going to somehow destroy the DNA that we already have in place. And I think that these social determinants of health also impact our communities. And because I grew up from an area where we once cultivated the land and cultivated our own medicines, and then being pushed to the reservation and having to live off of government resources that really did our people in terms of healthcare, because they were giving us government subsidies. And these foods are the most horrible foods you can imagine.
Yeah.
And they had no nutrients. They were not nutrient dense. They, and of course, did impact our community in so many ways, to where we have chronic illnesses from left to right that are still plaguing our society today. And it's now become a generational chronic illness, of course, from cancers to diabetes. And that's why, for us and for myself, I want to make sure that, we're taking action when it comes down to nutritional health, and including this as a supplemental strategy for healthcare and healthcare going into the future. So we got to look into soil quality and the nutrients we put into our foods, and make sure our foods are quality. But again, all to sustainable use. We want to make sure that people can afford these foods. And of course, I'm looking at practical solutions when it comes to primary care.
You unpacked so many important things there. You talked about social determinants of health. You talked about food sovereignty. You talked about the commodity program on the reservations that has made those populations so sick. And looking historically what happened, not only were the lands taken away, but food sovereignty, meaning their ability to control and gather and hunt their own foods, their traditional foods, was impacted. And in order for them to be fed, they received large amounts of government surplus foods, white flour, white sugar, and white fat, known as Crisco or shortening. And these became the staple foods. And, I had a number of experiences with a few Native Americans. One was a doctor. I went on a trip in Utah with my daughter. We were rappelling down a canyon and we got stuck. It was a flash flood, and I got stuck for quite a while on this platform. And there was this obstetrician gynecologist was from Alaska, and a First Nation people from there, and he was telling me the story of how he was very overweight and very diabetic, and was eating all the traditional sort of Western foods. And he was a doctor, and he sort of thought he knew better. And he said that he realized he wanted to not be like that. And he went back to what were his ancestors eating. They were eating salmon. They were eating the wild foods and the wild plants. And he literally transformed his diet and went back to being healthy. And a few years later, I went on a rafting trip with the head of the Ute Nation and a Hopi chief on the Green River to bring awareness to the tar sands mining in the Havasu Plateau. And and the woman, one of the Native women was telling me about how they have a word for people in their community who eat a lot of these commodity foods. They call it commodbod, which is like a word to describe people whose bodies get really big and overweight from eating these foods. And it's become such an incredible issue in these communities. It has led to, an overwhelming burden of diabetes. Like, for example, certain communities, Native communities in America, 80% get diabetes by the time they're 30. Their life expectancy is 46. And they are, the Pima, for example, the second most obese population in the world. It's not an accident. They weren't like that 100 years ago. Their food environment was changed and their access to their traditional foods was changed. And I think, we're seeing the same consequences in these communities with COVID. They're having lack of access to care. Their underlying health conditions make them predisposed, and they're not able to get the kind of care that they need. And these social determinants turn into a much bigger factor. So can you talk a little bit about this sort of issue of food sovereignty and what you mean by that, and how those issues can be solved for communities? Because it's really a microcosm for what's happened, not just to these Native populations, but to all these populations. And I was talking to a rancher the other day who grew up in the 60s, and he said, when I grew up on a farm, we had dozens and dozens of crops. We had dozens of different animals. We ate from our farm. Everything was fresh. And then now, most farms in America have 1 or 2 or 3 crops, and they're big, giant monocrop corn, wheat, or soy crops. And farmers don't eat from their land, and they're overweight, and they're sick, and they're unhealthy. And these rural communities too. So it's not just, a select population like the Native Americans. It's everybody's being affected by the loss of our food sovereignty. So can you talk more about that, and how do you think about that, and how we might solve that problem?
I think it's always, everything starts local. And, in our communities, very rural, it's really on the people to have, the will within themselves to take action. And so for a lot of our people, they are, finding swaths of land, and they're building community, and everything is about community. Healthcare is only sustainable when you have community invested in. And so there has to be this complete buy-in. But it's nice that, people, because it wasn't taught within the school systems, to remind some folks, gardening or cultivating your land was actually taught in schools when we were younger.
Hmm.
No, taught in schools. So children are having to figure out for themselves, how do we garden? And of course, a lot of people are still trying to get back to that. And even myself, so we all have to relearn how to garden and grow our own foods. But food sovereignty to me is, the way forward. I look at this as a complete opportunity as people are starting to see that, growing your own foods, you can, you trust what's in your resources. You also can have farmers markets. It's a good way for people to share, in this community building of food sovereignty. But I see that there's a rise in, communities growing gardens, whether it's in the urban city centers or it's in rural Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
Culture is starting to pick up, and people understand that growing your own foods is better, because we still don't have a Congress or a legislative body who are going to adhere to people having transparency in the labels and knowing what is in their foods. Monsanto or Bayer, they're still, they still have the upper hand, and they're still leading the way and having chemicals introduced into our food systems. And now it's polluting our water, and it's getting into our air, and everything is starting to get more and more polluted. So the people have to fight for complete integrity and the structure of the resources or the nutrients that they're putting into their systems.
Yeah, it's such an important point, because I think, as I remember, I lived in Idaho for 4 years. I was a family doctor, worked in a small town, and it was a very conservative community, but people there were really focused on subsistence living. So they all sort of had jobs here and there, but they all hunted. I mean, there was a week, it was hunting season, was a week off of work. It was a holiday. And then they all had big gardens, and they all grew their own food. They raised animals, they hunted, and it was just part of the culture there. And, you couldn't find a vegetable in the grocery store. So that was part of the problem. But I think learning how to reclaim it, whether it's in urban gardens, urban farming, farmers market, community support agriculture, these are all ways people can start to reclaim our foodways. And I think it helps sort of reclaim food sovereignty. And whether it's in the Bronx with, African Americans reclaiming their food, or it's on reservations, or Native Americans, or whether it's just people in their own homes and community gardens in their neighborhood making a difference, it's huge. The next thing I sort of want to get into is this whole idea of social determinants of health, because I think people hear the word, they hear about it, they don't understand it. What does it mean? How does it relate? And, from a doctor's perspective, 20% of health happens in the healthcare system. Yes, you need treatment. I had recently had back surgery and I needed to go in the hospital and get that done, and that was fine. That really helped me. But 80% of health happens outside the clinic, outside the hospital, outside the doctor's office. And it's something that the healthcare system doesn't really address. And when I've heard you talk about healthcare, you have a more nuanced view than just Medicare for all, or, keeping things as they are, or, restricting or repealing Obamacare. There's these two polarized views, and neither of them really solve the problem of why we're all sick in the first place, and why healthcare is so overburdened, and why it's so costly in the first place. So can you talk about how you think differently about this? Because I think it's such an important perspective, and how it links back to these social determinants issues.
Well, with the rising, chronic care, I see how the left and the right are, getting into these dysfunctional outcomes about healthcare, what healthcare should look like. But for me, I served on my tribal council, and I saw the differences that can be made when you invest more in youth activities, or when you invest more into community activities that are holistic and all incorporative. And I mean that, there's other therapies that, will help sustain, an elder's livelihoods as long as they're not on some pharmaceutical drug. There's differences that could be made. If my grandparents can live long lives, I know that this can work for everybody.
Hi everyone, hope you're enjoying the episode. Before we continue, we have a quick message from Dr. Mark Hyman about his new company, Farmacy, and their first product, the 10-Day Reset.
Hey, it's Dr. Hyman. Do you have FLC? What's FLC? It's when you feel like crap. It's a problem that so many people suffer from and often have no idea that it's not normal or that you can fix it. I mean, you know the feeling. It's when you're super sluggish, your digestion's off, you can't think clearly, or you have brain fog, or you just feel run down. Can you relate? I know most people can. But the real question is, what the heck do we do about it? Well, I hate to break the news, but there's no magic bullet. FLC isn't caused by one single thing, so there's not one single solution. However, there is a systems-based approach, a way to tackle the multiple root factors that contribute to FLC, and I call that system the 10-Day Reset. The 10-Day Reset combines food, key lifestyle habits, and targeted supplements to address FLC straight on. It's a protocol that I've used with thousands of my community members to help them get their health back on track. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a quick fix. It's a system that works. If you want to learn more and get your health back on track, click on the button below or visit getfarmacy.com. That's getfarmacy with an F, Farmacy.com.
Now back to this week's episode.
My grandfather was also sometimes referred to as a mountain goat, because he would be up and down the mountains every day. He ate really well. He normally relied on roots and berries, and people would say, "God, this man is strong." And he was a workhorse, smart, brilliant man. But the fact that he was able to survive so long and be so strong in mind and body really, I think, proved to me more so, what it takes to think about, how you take care of your own system, your body, your health. But I do see the adverse effects of childhood events, and I think we all have different effects in our lives, and I just see that stress reduction, especially within my path, really helps. So these sorts of therapies are very healing. That's why we reach back into our culture, and we really resort to our ceremonies, because our ceremonies help us to stay focused on what's important, what matters, and not be distracted by all the elements in the world. And of course, there are other therapies like acupuncture and chiropractic care and physical therapy. We actually utilize all of these different therapies within our community, and we've seen that functional medicine like this has really helped to bring longevity into our community, from even cutting costs in healthcare. But primary care and preventative care, that is to me the solution to helping really heal this country. A lot of folks don't have access to primary care. A lot of folks don't have access to acupuncture or chiropractic care or certain therapies, even just things like behavioral health. And we're not investing enough into our youth. But to me, it's about preventative measures. So why are we not, investing in early childhood education and, of course, youth community programs? Those certain aspects to a person's development, to me, adheres to the overall healthcare program. That's why I often will assimilate that early education is so important and is a big part of how a young child will see themselves and take their developmental portion into their physical development and put that as a priority. We must start early and not wait until a person's much later into their life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to get the kids going on it. And I think, the other aspect that's so, I think, unique about what we're learning about these social determinants is that the power of the social connections that we have, the power of groups and community and ceremony, it's been part of traditional Native culture for thousands and thousands of years. They call it a tribe, right? And we're all, our biggest healthcare risk is loneliness. 40% of the elderly describe themselves as lonely. And I think that this is one of the biggest drivers of disease. People don't realize that it's actually a risk factor for death. It's a risk factor for heart disease. It's a risk factor for cancer, for stroke, diabetes. And I think the traditional cultures often have these embedded community-based structures, whether it's the Okinawans and the Moai, which are their sort of little units that they form at birth with a group of 4 or 5 other little kids, and they stay that way for the entire life and are there for everything with each other. And that forms that level of connection and community, and that is so powerfully healing. And I helped start a program called the Daniel Plan with a church in Saddleback with Rick Warren, and we used the power of these small groups to help people transform their lives. We had 15,000 people lose 250,000 pounds in a year by doing it together in groups, not with a doctor or nurse or nutritionist, but just each other, supporting each other. And I think, this is part of how we're going to have to disrupt healthcare, not just in the doctor's office, but actually in the community. And I think I'd love to hear how you think we might be able to do that and what we could learn from, traditional communities about how that could be done.
We're not recreating the wheel here, which is nice. We have these wonderful ceremonies already in place. And, one of my elders would often state that, our community, our traditional people are about verbs and taking action, versus the Western culture, which is all about nouns. And
I never thought of that. You're right.
And when you hear that, it gets you thinking, because it's true. And I thought, this is the Indigenous worldview, and it's so beautiful to me, but something we often take for granted. And now here I am in the political scene, and I get to enact this way of life, this type of leadership, which is so unique to many. But I said, this is the way we think, and I hope that this will become a culture, changing people's minds and lives. And now that we are going through so many crises, from the financial crisis to the epidemic that we're facing, I think people are much more aware of how important community is. Now that they're being isolated and people are suffering from not only behavioral health issues, but their own personal medicinal issues, because they have to isolate themselves for multiple reasons. And then, of course, people are struggling financially. So it's, I'm starting to see all these adverse effects, and it's reshaping the way we think. And I'm hoping that this will get us back to, this holistic worldview that we have indigenously. And, I want us to get back to, how important it is to think with community. Even the clinic had affirmed in this group study that group visits are, in fact, better than one-on-one visits.
Yeah.
Scientists, researchers are starting to find out that people heal better when they're healed as a community.
Yeah, I'm not sure you're aware of that, but that actually came out of my work at Cleveland Clinic, because when I worked with the church, I realized how powerful this was, and I wanted to bring that model into healthcare. And so we developed these groups based on this framework of peer support. And that's what we began to found, is that not only people get better, but they get better much faster. And we're going to be publishing some of that data soon, which is pretty exciting to see. And I think it's going to underscore that it's cheaper to deliver care that way. It's more effective. The outcomes are better, and the outcomes are faster. And people actually get this extra medicine, which is, I call it love. Love medicine. It's the power of connection and community, because it's so desperately needed. I just want to sort of unpack a little bit about this social determinants, because I think people don't really have a framework for it. And, it's defined in many different ways, but it sort of involves pretty much everything outside of the doctor's office or hospital that happens that relates to your health, including your conditions of birth, your early childhood, as you mentioned, your experiences, your education, work, access to work, the social circumstances of your elders, transportation, housing, a sense of community, self-efficacy, and even things like environmental toxins, gun violence, and of course our food environment. All of these things are the social drivers, and they have enormous impact. And what most doctors are very busy trying to treat things with incremental benefit. They'll give you a drug to reduce your blood pressure, or a drug to reduce your cholesterol, or a drug to reduce your blood sugar, but the magnitude of those effects is so small compared to the magnitude of the effects of dealing with these other factors in terms of life expectancy. And there's something called the subway map, which is pretty frightening. It's basically looking at people who reside in Midtown Manhattan compared to those who live in the Bronx. And the life expectancy differs by 10 years. So it's 6 months for every stop on the subway. In Chicago, there's something called the Loop, and then the west side of the city, which is more affluent and non-affluent areas. The life expectancy is 16 years. So when you look at medical interventions, there is nothing that comes close to that. For example, if we completely eliminated heart disease, life expectancy would go up by 4 years, just a quarter of what it would be if we actually address these social determinants. And it's affecting so many people. There's 40 million people who are hungry. There's 600,000 are homeless. There's 2.3 million in jails. There's 40 million in poverty. There's 40% of our elders live in loneliness. And it's just this rampant problem that is seemingly ignored by most people in healthcare and most people in politics. And it seems like if we're really going to be serious about taking an evidence-based approach to addressing the challenges of healthcare and reducing healthcare costs and improving the health of our population, we just can't ignore this anymore. I mean, how do you see moving forward in making inroads and addressing those things?
Well, that's why we're running for Congress. I mean, you have an opportunity here to have a seat in the Senate. And I feel that the fiscal stability of the United States will remain elusive until healthcare is actually fixed. I'm thankful that we have, a great team, and our staff is very well aware of, the fixes that can be in play for healthcare in this country. But you touched a lot of this.
There's a lot of stuff.
I mean, there's an opportunity to fix, what we're talking about. That there's trillions of dollars that are being expended into chronic care, and we can save year after year trillions of dollars just by talking more in implementation of preventative measures, preventative healthcare, holistic healthcare. And I think that folks who are very much attuned to Medicare for all, it's clear that, even in red states like mine, that folks want good healthcare, but they also just want access to healthcare. And of course, when they're talking about the cost, it's all variable. People want choice, but yet really they want the most accessible and the best healthcare. And for me, it's not going to be the pharmaceutical industry that should have the reins here. It's going to be those who are more about the long-term care, and they're not the ones who are being incentivized. They're not the ones who are being reimbursed or covered under insurance. But we want to make sure that they're included, and that should be the future of healthcare. And this is our time. This is our time to re-engineer what healthcare should look like in this country. I think that there are people who are on the left and the right who can agree with me that integrative solutions like what we're promoting will certainly be the best option moving forward, because we're tired of the nonsense that the health insurance companies are bringing in, that the pharmaceutical companies are bringing. People want to heal and they want to feel safe and secure, in this life that, they're not going to be fed more toxic chemicals that are going to make them sicker. But they're also tired of being poor, and too much of our money goes down the drain, spending this broken system that we call the healthcare of the United States of America as is. I think we're taking a good hard look, and while the ACA is fundamentally built on expanding access and having the government pay for it, we have yet again this opportunity to reform healthcare in America that certainly be re-engineered from the ground up. And this is what I stand on in my campaign.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, access, I believe is a human right. I mean, healthcare should be a human right. At some level, basic care should be available to everybody. In most developed countries, it is. In this country, it's not. It's very tough. And there's a tiered healthcare system for sure. But it also is really clear that we have an opportunity to deal with this chronic disease epidemic in a different way. In a way that addresses the root causes of it. And just by expansion, I mean, I'm terrified by the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid. Why? Not because I don't want people to have access, because if we open the floodgates and let more sick people in the system, it's going to be overwhelmed. We saw what happened with COVID-19, but when you think about the fact that 6 out of 10 Americans have a chronic illness, that 75% are overweight, that 4 out of 10 kids are overweight. I mean, we have such a burden, and unless we stop the flood of people into the system, we're really not going to be able to solve this problem. We're going to keep basically bailing the boat while the boat's sinking instead of going, why don't we plug the hole in the boat? And the plugging the hole in the boat has to start with dealing with why people are sick in the first place, which is a lot of these social determinants, but a lot of them have to do with people's chronic health conditions that are driven in large part by the poor quality of our food. I think there were 3% of the population, 50 years ago that was chronically ill, and now it's 60%. I mean, it's staggering when you think about that number. So I think we have a real chance to start to reimagine that. And it also has to do not just with our access and food, but also agriculture. And, so we talked a lot about, the social determinants and the need to change our food system, but you also address the issues around agriculture and how important that is as part of the continuum to solve this problem of chronic disease. That it really starts not just in the doctor's office, but on the farm and the ranch. And you grew up in Idaho, which is a rural farming community. You grew up on a ranch and a farm. You grew up with elders who were involved in planting and growing and raising food. How did that influence your view of what we should be doing? And how do you reimagine what our agricultural system should be to solve some of these big crises, not just for food, but also some of the environmental and bigger issues around carbon emissions from our agricultural system?
Yeah, that's that question is the best question I think I've heard in so many years, because people must understand that the foods that we grow, the relationship that we must have with the land is the most important relationship when it comes to healthcare. Because it all starts there. That's the very beginning. What we produce in agriculture and what we're able to cultivate on the land, the direct connection and relationship we have to the land via our roots, our medicines, that is one of the most important relationships. And so many of our ceremonies are built around the cultivation of our land. And I will tell you from my young childhood, watching my grandfather, looking over the family farm, he would have, there was always all these fields that I grew up around. And this one large vast field he would be overlooking as the sun would be rising. And, he would always be in prayer, and he would talk about, this, being grateful and speaking to the spiritual element of the land. So it wasn't just, let's just water here and water there and let's put some seeds down and let it be done and then call it good. It was, it was a constant relationship. And he was often nurturing that relationship on a daily basis, and it was very intimate. It was almost like this was his partner. He had a love relationship, a love connection. And so as he was talking to the crops, he was always talking to the crops with our resources in the most beautiful way. I think it really drew out in him, the sensitive side of him. To me, that inner spiritual element of him that made him feel whole. So you can tell that, this is why our farmers who are suffering right now, who are hurting, why this, whether that's the climate crisis or the economic crisis that's impacting them. There's so many who are suffering right now, but they have that direct spiritual connection with the land that is so important and so beautiful at the same time, and precious. And so I see what that's like growing up, and I see how important that is for our farmers. But it's also important that they are supported, because they are also healers. They're able to cultivate the land and provide a resource to all of us to be healing. But it's important that they are too cared for and protected. So I say this because we've had some farmers who have been hurt and hit pretty hard financially, and so thinking about the whole political structure, why we have to keep them in mind, and not just for the sake of healthcare and going all the way back to nutritional care and food sovereignty, and why farmers should be included in all of this, but just knowing that relationship that my grandfather had and understanding what that meant and what that looks like taught me a lot about what it is we have to keep in mind, that the foods that we eat or whatever we cultivate, these medicines, all of that is it's a privilege for us. It's a privilege for us to be connected to Mother Earth in this way, and we must honor that relationship, nurtured in return, because this is Mother's way of nurturing us. But we have to take care of that relationship. It's not just the receive. It has to be a give and take. We have to be respectful in the same way.
Well, it turns out what you're saying is actually, it's based on a spiritual tradition of living in harmony with the natural cycles and with the ecosystem, which is how those communities have survived for thousands of years. But it turns out that scientifically, we're coming to the same conclusion, that in order to create a vibrant agricultural system, we have to work with nature rather than against nature. And that means creating a model of agriculture that we've talked about called regenerative agriculture, that regenerates the soil, that regenerates the water resources that we have, that regenerates the biodiversity, that regenerates the nutrient density of the food, that regenerates the health of the people that eat the food. And that is such a foreign notion to how we're actually doing it. And it's not a sort of, feel good, nice to do, new age thing to happen. It's actually a economic, an environmental, a health, and political imperative, because if we don't do it, according to the UN, we have only 60 harvests left of soil, and we run out of soil, we run out of humans. So, this whole model of these traditional ways of actually thinking about how do we work within ecosystems to restore them is really what we're talking about, whether it's an ecosystem of a community, whether it's an ecosystem on the land and agriculture. All of it's really connected. And as a functional medicine doctor, I often think of myself in the same way as a regenerative farmer, because my job as a functional medicine doctor is to restore a healthy ecosystem so disease can't happen, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't need to put in chemicals like drugs. So I don't need to put in all these supports. And in regenerative farming, you don't need the chemicals and the fertilizer, not because you have an idea against them, but because it works better without them, right? Because you create a healthy farm environment, you create healthy food, the pests can't show up, and it all works. And I think, it's interesting. It sort of takes us a while as humans to get it right, but I think, if we understand that this is an economic imperative and a political imperative to address some of the biggest crises we face, then it's just such a beautiful thing to think about. How do we create a regenerative healthcare and a regenerative agriculture system to solve so many of these issues? And I think it's so exciting to hear someone talking about this and bringing this into the conversation, whether you're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think we all care about our health. You have a body, whatever you believe, you have a body, whatever political party you join, you're a body, whatever race you are, you have a body. And I think we really have sort of ignored that this is not a political issue. There are many ways to solve the problem, and there are controversies about how to do it. But I think, you're one of the few people I've really heard talking about a new way of thinking that actually gets to the root of the problem, which is not just more access or restricted access or whatever. It's actually the right solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that about, regenerative agriculture, because regenerative agriculture is starting to catch on as a culture in the community, and they're starting to shift away from, the heavy chemical companies that are that we're weighing in so heavily, like Monsanto, on our local ag. But long-term sustainability is what we want. We want our farmers to be successful. So any which way that we can provide these solutions, the better. And I appreciate that you're, connecting healthcare to ag in that way, because I don't think a lot of folks see that, but they need to start having that conversation, and this needs to be a dialogue that everybody continues to, to talk about.
Yeah, I want to sort of finish up on a topic which may be a little bit challenging, and it's something I think a lot about. And as a white guy, like I don't really have an old white guy, I don't really have a good sense of it. But the thing that I see in some of these communities that are burdened, whether they're poor white communities in the South, whether they're urban African American communities, whether they're Native communities on reservations, that a lot of the problems have been internalized. And I sort of, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. I was on this rafting trip that I was on a number of years ago with this Hopi chief, and he was very, very overweight. His wife was very, very, very overweight, and he lived in one of the longest inhabited communities in America, over 1,000 years old. This community has been in Arizona, and he was very, very unhealthy, very diabetic, but he was the keeper of the ceremonies. And I said to him, he got very sick on the trip. He had trouble just walking down the trail to the rafting boat, and he was throwing up, and it was just really struggling. And I was like, you can solve this. You can get rid of your diabetes. He's like, really? He says, how do I do that? I said, well, you have to give up starch and sugar and the sodas, which is causing all the problems with your metabolism. He's like, oh my God, well, I could, but how are we going to do our traditional Hopi ceremonies? Because we need our traditional Hopi ceremonial foods. And I said, what are those foods? He says, cake and cookies and pies. And it sort of shocked me. And I was like, wow, I think he really feels like these are his traditional foods, like Indian fry bread. There's nothing Indian about fry bread. It's something that was based on these government commodity foods that have, turned these populations into, the sickest group in America. So how do you see these populations, whether, it's the African Americans or the poor white communities or the Native communities, starting to break free from this internalized sense of this is their food and this is what we know, and to change that dynamic? Because it seems as though if these communities could say, we want to reclaim our traditional food ways, if we want to go learn more about how our ancestors used to eat, because that's what will make us healthy, it would transform everything. So how do you see addressing that? Because it's not just a Native issue. It's really across all these communities that are so impoverished, and the ones that are traditionally now being more affected by COVID-19, the Hispanic, the Latin American and communities, and the African American Native communities. These are the ones that are the most affected.
Mm-hmm. Well, it affects all communities of color and all economically suppressed communities. But it really goes far deeper than just, being impacted by government foods in the tribal community, because we're talking about, decades-long, systemic governmental system that, imposed themselves on a community that was relying on the land. Of course, it also impacted all of our natural resources. So we're talking about a much greater issue where, all the dams that were put in place that restricted or choked out our river systems and cut our supply to omega-3, omega-6 foods, oils that would have been, a huge part of our diet. And the fact that we were not able to leave the reservations to go and hunt and fish, that restricted our access to, certain foods, amino acids in our deer, all these supplemental nutrients that really would have helped us along the way that we thrived on for so many generations, and being cut off to having access to all of this, including this simple elements like clean water. All of our water was polluted. And so when you get that with the chemical contaminants, the toxic waste that was in our water system, yes, that's going to, greatly impact our health and then the after effects. So we have all of these issues that we're dealing with because everything's been polluted for the sake of corporate greed and, and all these developments. But we're trying to get back to that. And of course, the indigenous communities are fighting because we've always been natural resources stewards and ambassadors. And we know that our relationship to the land is really what is going to effectively heal us. So we're trying to come back to that healing way, that healing relationship again. And it's taken some time because our people, we held on to gathering our roots, our old medicines. We have still held on to those ceremonies. But now we got to come another step forward and get back to replenishing our river systems, because even those river systems are still affected, and we have not been able to get those numbers back up because that was a huge part of our diet. And the dwindling, the wildlife populations that are getting sick or overwrought with disease because of their there's a lot of issues, I would say. It's all across the board. But that is
is there insight that the food is actually making them sick? That it's the thing that's causing the problem?
I
found in some African American communities and poor white, they don't connect the dots between what they're eating and why they're sick.
I would say a lot of that is true because of looking at historically what has been taken away from our people as, a simple diet structure. And then you fast forward to today, and we were forced to eat government subsidized foods that were lacking all kinds of nutrients. They were just, like you talked about the medicine man who, was eating these unhealthy foods into his ceremony, but that's all he had. He didn't have access to these other foods that were nutrient dense because he was restricted, and often that's because of the placement of the government or the government cutting off those resources for the tribal community.
So he didn't have access for sure, but it almost like he didn't realize that what he was eating wasn't the traditional food. And that was the part where it was this cognitive leap for him to go, wow, this is stuff that's not our traditional. This is white people's food, right? And I think that was sort of shocking to me because it felt like unless that internalized racism, in a sense, gets removed, it's going to be hard for people to say, we don't want this anymore. Like, we don't want our sodas. We don't want the fry bread. We don't want whatever we're eating. And I think, I've seen this, across poor or minority communities across America. And I think it's an obstacle in my mind, because it limits people's feeling of being empowered to make a difference. They don't see themselves as being victimized by that. They just think it's okay. And that how do you root that out? I think that's a question I've struggled with a long time, and I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Well, I think it goes back again to reconnecting our people to the old ways, and I think that's why there are other communities who are talking about this, who are getting back to their roots. For those of us who have not lost that connection, we're still going out to gather roots, and we're still going out fishing and hunting, and we're doing all these things to ensure that our systems are replenished and our needs are met. And I see that while there are folks who still struggle with that, in some communities, because they did adapt to, certain foods like fry bread or sugary sodas, and there are others who are just reclaiming their traditional element, their indigenous roots, and they're getting back to that too. So I cannot say that everyone is adhering to it, because they're starting to realize, like, okay, this is hurting us more than helping us. It's making our children sick and obese, and we have to now get back to organic foods and growing our own, which is why the culture of and the element of food sovereignty is growing in our communities, and people understand that we have to start either growing our own foods or buying organic foods, and eliminate genetically modified foods from our system, or eliminate more sugars or processed foods. But understand that where many of our communities are, they're often in food deserts, or they're in locations where the grocery market offers very little produce and natural foods, and it's all mostly processed foods. So a lot of these communities are really challenged by their geographical location. They have to drive an hour out to get to a farmer's market or get to a Whole Foods market, where they're able to have sustainable foods that are going to be more healing than what the foods that they're offered within their small community. That's very remote.
Yeah, no, I lived on 2 reservations. I lived on the Hopi Reservation for a while and the Nez Perce Reservation, and it definitely was a food desert. And I think that was sort of shocking to me that it was really difficult to find real food and that there was really no access to things that were going to help them promote health. And, I had to drive, 50 miles each way to get, quality food. And, you do that once every few weeks. It was really challenging. And if you don't have the access, you don't have the resources, you don't have a car, I mean, it's really pretty challenging. So I'm sort of encouraged to think about bringing these conversations into the political discourse, because once we start to talk about them, we force people to talk about it. And I think the other day, Joe Biden had a town hall with Jose Andres, who's a chef, talking about the issues of food and food insecurity. And I think it was the first time really that I've seen in a political campaign where the issue of food is really brought to the forefront. And to me, it's one of the most central things, because food connects to agriculture and health. And you put all those things together and you've got some of the biggest issues of America and also some of the biggest solutions, which is so exciting.
Well, I think, and I think that's great that he did that, because right now when people are stuck in their homes, they're talking about the COVID diet, and most people are walking out, having gained 20 pounds or more.
Yeah, the COVID-19, they call it.
Yeah, and I find that interesting, because I know people are now thinking more about what they're putting into their bodies now more than ever, because they're starting to see that, okay, I have to cook my own food, and I want to cook in a holistic sense, and get back to eating healthy and not having to be on the go and driving and not having much time. And all our time really does get spent being in transit, going somewhere to and from. But it's nice to be home and get to focus on what you put on your plate. And I think that really does change the way we think too. So this is, it is a blessing in disguise, in some ways, because we're starting to take a healthcare and think of food in a whole different sense, and we're rebuilding that relationship up in a positive way, as I am with my own kids. But that, that portion of wanting to have or cook organically, that's become, a staple here in my household.
So how has this whole COVID-19 pandemic changed you and your family and your thinking about your own health and the world itself? Well,
I guess what it does ultimately is it humbles us. It humbles us to refocus and to get back to square one. And so for me, it's starting to be more of a reminder to slow down, and then to recenter so that we can connect spiritually. And that's not the easiest thing to do, but for us being out in nature, that's why we connect more with nature. I feel like that's what this is doing. It's slowing everything down so that we can get back to focus. And once we are able to focus again, then we can start to see what our real purpose is here, and look at everything that's happening. And I think that's really what has been the problem is, we've all been distracted, from the hectic work life to the drama in politics and everything else. And now we're able to slow down and see the beauty of this opportunity of being here on this planet in this lifetime, and taking care of each other and loving one another, and being able to be forgiving and to be healed by nature. And I'm just thankful for this time. It's a good time for all of us to be grateful. But that's what I've been experiencing with my own sons.
Yeah. It's almost like God gave us all a big time out as humanity for misbehaving, and we got to go to our room and think about what we're doing and how we need to maybe rethink what we want to be after, because I don't think we want to go back to what was normal. Normal wasn't good for any of us. So this crazy way we're living, the rapacious way that our economy was going, the growing disparities, the increasing burdens of disease, the economic impact of it. And I mean, all these problems now it becomes so evident. I mean, it's like, I heard stories of people, in Brazil where like the water's clearing up and dolphins are coming back and animals are coming back. It's almost like, when Chernobyl happened, everybody left. And now there's this amazing documentary with, I think, David Attenborough about how Chernobyl has become this incredible, lush, ecological system with animals all over and trees. And it's like it's like a nature preserve. It's pretty wild. I don't know if they're all glowing in the dark, but it's amazing how just, stopping for a minute, we can kind of look at what we want as humanity going forward. I think this is a very important moment for us historically. I think voices like yours are really important to bring these issues out there and talk about things that really matter, about community, about food, about the social determinants, about healthcare, agriculture. These are things that I think are more and more important in the political conversation. And I'm just so happy that you're out there talking about these things. And I think whether you're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. These issues need to be talked about. They affect all of us. It doesn't matter who you are. And I think I just appreciate that we're going to be able to have these conversations going forward over the next months. And I think really thank you for your dedication and service, because it's not easy being in politics these days. So really grateful for you.
Thank you, Mark. And you're absolutely right. I'm thankful that you understand, what the world really could and should look like with everything that we've discussed, from healthcare to our natural resources and the environment and the fiscal impacts, everything that's in place right now. But getting back to the center is important. And, I'm happy to be talking about it and bringing this conversation to politics. People need to know that politics now more than ever impacts their lives. So leadership matters, and that's why I'm here. Politics is not fun for anybody, but when you look at it, it does impact a lot of good things, and we want to make sure that we're protecting nature and protecting humanity, and that's really what it gets down to.
Well, thank you for talking about these issues. We need to talk more about them. I've been out there with our Food Fix campaign trying to get politicians to really understand these issues, and I'm excited to be able to sort of have these conversations. So thank you so much for being on the Doctor's Farmacy. I hope you listening love this conversation, and if you loved it, please share it with your friends and family on social media. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time on the Doctor's Farmacy.